I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as the situation around the frontline city of Pokrovsk continues to worsen, we examine Ukraine's latest wave of deep strikes targeting Russia's military infrastructure. Then we turn to Brussels, where frustration mounts after European nations failed to agree on how to unlock frozen Russian assets to support Kyiv's war effort. Then we hear about the motorway some believe could save NATO from Putin's aggression.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 28th of October, 3 years and 249 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes and our chief foreign affairs commentator, David Blair. First, the latest military updates of the past 24 hours. Russia outnumbers Ukrainian troops 8-1 in Pokrovsk in eastern Donetsk. So President Zelensky told journalists this week. Imagine how many Russian forces are there, he said, but at the same time, they have not achieved the planned result. The situation in that semi-surrounded city remains precarious, as we've been reporting for several days. There continue to be reports of street fighting and major engagements on the outskirts, such as the one we discussed yesterday, which saw a Russian armoured column unsuccessfully seek to break through near Shahovey. The ISW and others claim Russian forces recently advanced in southeastern Minograd, just east of Pokrovsk. But, in their words, these advances are unlikely to cause an immediate collapse of the Ukrainian pocket in the Pokrovsk direction. A spokesperson for the Ukrainian Eastern Group of Forces said yesterday Moscow's troops do not have full control over any positions in Pokrovsk, but noted Russian forces maintain a 10-1 drone advantage over Ukrainian troops there. As reported last week, Russia has fire control over all egress routes from the city, effectively entrapping 1,200 civilians, and, apparently, is indiscriminately killing them, including those attempting to evacuate both on foot and in vehicles. That Ukrainian spokesperson I cited a moment ago claims some Russian troops are even wearing civilian clothes as part of deception tactics. That is obviously a war crime under the Geneva Convention, if true. We covered the apparent execution of civilians on last Thursday's episode with the Telegraph's senior foreign correspondent Memphis Barker. I recommend listening to that for a more vivid picture as to the nature of the situation in the city at present. For broader context, Putin reportedly demanded Russian forces seize Pokrovsk by mid-November. It has been a core target ever since Russian capture of Avdiivka, 40 kilometres southeast in February 2024. They've now surrounded it from three sides, leaving about a 15-kilometre gap for the Ukrainian military to bring in troops and supplies. All the bridges into Pokrovsk were blown up by the Russians, so the evacuation of the wounded is nearly impossible. Western military experts who spoke to the Kyiv Independent said it would be crucial for Ukraine to withdraw in a timely manner once it no longer makes tactical sense to hold the city, given the increasingly strained supply routes. According to one of them, recent weather conditions have aided Russia's advance in the sector. Prolonged periods of dense fog, combined with favourable winds that obscure drone visibility, have enabled Russian forces to conduct mechanised assaults and press more aggressively into Pokrovsk with infantry. We continue to monitor that situation closely. Those analysts still believe it is unlikely the fall of the city is imminent, just that it is inevitable over the coming weeks as things stand. Elsewhere on the front lines, up in Kharkiv, Russian forces continued offensive operations around Kupiansk yesterday, but did not make confirmed advances. There continues to be fierce fighting in other areas, but for now, much of the focus is on Donetsk. The other major military activity of the past 24 hours is in the air, with Ukraine striking an oil refinery as well as a chemical plant in Russia's western regions overnight. Explosions were reported at multiple locations, including oil depots in occupied Crimea and refineries in Ulyanovsk Oblast and Stavropol Krai, both in Russia. Monitoring groups published videos showing vast plumes of smoke and storage tanks engulfed in flames. In Ulyanovsk, the NS oil refinery is erupting in a massive blaze, apparently as we speak. Russian Telegram channels circulate footage of the inferno, citing local residents who described shockwaves felt across the area. Further south, in Stavropol Krai, Ukrainian drones reportedly struck a chemical plant there that is a subsidiary of Lukoil, and more on Lukoil, of course, later on. The facility produces petrochemical goods vital to Russia's industrial and military supply chains. Videos posted online appear to show a radiating fire consuming large parts of that complex. Meanwhile, in Russia's Bashkortostan region, an underground gas storage complex is also reportedly ablaze. Ukrainian drones reportedly hit it, and then as well an oil refinery in the Mary El Republic, more than 1,000 kilometres from the front lines. In terms of other incidents, Ukraine's military intelligence said yesterday that in the past fortnight it struck 2 Russian radar stations and a launch pad for a Russian anti-aircraft missile system in eastern Donbass. We can't independently verify this. The footage appears genuine as far as we can tell. Last night, SBU strike drones also claimed to have hit a Russian air defense system worth $20 million and 2 radar stations in occupied Crimea, as well as eliminating a Russian officer involved in what they called the genocide of Ukrainian people in the Kyiv region. He was blown up by a car bomb inside Russia. Now, our friends at The Insider also report that a Russian Ka-52 attack helicopter was shot down by friendly fire while repelling a Ukrainian drone attack inside Russia, killing the crew. A source claims it was mistaken for a drone, prompting a Russian fighter jet to open fire. The Insider calculates that this is the 17th documented case of Russia's own aircraft being destroyed by friendly fire since the start of the full-scale invasion. So those are the major military updates. But before I turn to our Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes to give us the latest in the diplomatic realm, some interesting reports of intelligence assessments in the US about Putin's objectives. According to NBC, a recent intelligence assessment warned he is more determined than ever to carry on the war and prevail on the battlefield. That analysis, communicated to members of Congress this month, indicated that the agencies see no sign Russia is ready to compromise. According to officials who've seen it, facing steep Russian troop losses and economic setbacks at home, he is committed to securing Ukrainian land and expanding his country's footprint to justify the human and financial toll. That tallies with the assessment of many voices you'll have heard on the podcast over the years, and I'd argue the historical evidence too. As societies become increasingly militarized, they are incentivized to escalate unless they are forced to stop. But this argument is seemingly unwelcome as far as officials in the Trump administration are concerned. According to the Wall Street Journal, at the start of Trump's second term, officials asked intelligence analysts for information on the situation in Ukraine in order to determine Putin's goals and assess his willingness to negotiate an end to the war. CIA analysts concluded that Trump might be able to find opportunities to negotiate. In contrast, analysts from the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, the INR, cited Putin's own remarks in which he emphasized the priority of demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine. The State Department concluded that Putin would ultimately not be willing to abandon his maximalist objectives. These assessments were prepared before the meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska. Crucially, the INR leadership later told analysts that their dissenting assessment was damaging the Bureau's standing amongst government officials. Afterwards, several analysts were fired and one resigned. If it were in doubt, that speaks volumes as to the mentality in the White House. They do not want to hear that Moscow doesn't want to end this war. They want to continue to pivot to the Pacific, as further evidenced by Trump's visit to Asia this week. And you might find more evidence of that fact in another story shared by the Kyiv Post, namely that the administration is poised to withdraw thousands of American troops from Romania. According to 3 US and European officials who've been briefed on the matter, the administration notified Western allies earlier this week of its decision to remove troops, with a formal announcement expected in the coming days. Speaking to the Kyiv Post, the officials, all who requested anonymity, said the troop reduction is not expected to exceed more than a battalion, and also said that the move will not significantly impact US operations in the region. And yet, that fact, and the fact there were internal discussions that initially considered reductions in both Romania and Poland, will lead to many people being worried. It sends, at the very least, a rather troubling message at a time when the situation in Eastern Europe remains volatile. Only last week, 2 unidentified drones flew near a barracks in South Estonia, with NATO forces shooting one of them down. So the perennial question remains, how will Europe respond? Which feels like the ideal moment to welcome back to the podcast our Brussels correspondent, Joe Barnes. Joe, it's been ages. Great to have you back on. You're going to talk us through the diplomatic updates in a moment before we discuss the mood in Brussels and a couple of stories you've been working on recently. So, Joe, where do you want to start?
Hi, Francis. Thank you for having me back. Yeah, it's been a long time, so it's good to see familiar faces logged in and listening to us. So let's start with the American withdrawal. NATO have actually put out a statement in the last few hours actually downplaying this as a problem. They're saying that US force posture in Europe is still greater than it was pre-Ukraine. I was speaking to some sort of NATO insiders, high-level diplomats and officials last week, and they were saying that actually because Joe Biden rushed, and it was almost double, I think, went from sort of like 40,000 to 80,000 troops from America into Europe. Actually, if you reduce it, you'll still have a bigger number than you did full-scale invasion in February 22. So they're not looking at it as a real problem as such in NATO. Like Romania have come out and said, look, we're still going to have 1,000 American troops based in Romania, and we still think America is entirely committed to NATO. So yes, look, there's a little bit of politics, like let's play up to Donald Trump, let's say he's great and stuff like that. But also they're downplaying it's not going to be a wholesale American withdrawal from Europe as Donald Trump and his administration shifts more Indo-Pacific. But yeah, let's then go into Ukraine, where President Zelensky has allowed Ukraine's defense ministry to launch, and I quote these 2 words, the controlled export of Ukrainian weapons abroad as of November 2025. So that's as of, a couple of days' time. This is a quote from Zelensky. He says, Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Denis Shmyhal, must, by the end of the year, ensure the full completion of tasks for the production and delivery of drones, FPV drones, interceptor drones, and drones for deep strike missions. The controlled export program for our weapons should be launched next month. Why is this important? Because you might remember back to him and Donald Trump, this moment where they were across the table and speaking about tomahawks in front of the media spray. And Zelensky was like, well, America has missiles, but modern warfare, Ukraine proves that you need more than missiles to be an effective military. And he then started speaking about his drones and saying you need to combine thousands of drones with missiles to be truly effective now. And he has been doing deals with America to basically share drone technology with America so America can produce its own drones. So this is actually just a sign of that working. So it's good news. It's going to allow basically Ukraine to do probably more swaps for weapons, not just with America, but with other countries. Because if they feel that they're getting, say, decent drone technology in exchange for some missiles, that might be a good quid pro quo. Anyway, a little bit to say on some interesting revelations about Russian reliance on foreign countries. One thing that Russia has been struggling to do is manufacture its own jet engines. It's long struggled, and I think its Aeroflot fleet still has a number of Boeing and Airbus products or airframes which require Western engines. Even then, the Soviet engines have been known to use sort of Rolls-Royce or other Western engines. So because of Western sanctions, they've not been able to get these parts for their planes, which have made their commuter and domestic aviation sector pretty hard hit. So what we now know is India's state-owned Hindustan Aeronautics, HAL, has signed a deal with Russia's United Aircraft Corporation, UAC, in Moscow to jointly produce the SJ-100 civil passenger aircraft. The agreement will grant India rights to manufacture the SJ-100 for domestic use, marking the first time a passenger aircraft will be fully produced in India. So UAC is sanctioned by all of the US, EU and UK for its role in sort of Russia's military-industrial complex. But this now poses that actually Russia is having to give away a lot of its tech, just like Zelensky is with drones, but it's having to give aircraft to India, basically ensure that it gets that continued support from India.
It's a very interesting story, that, because it does speak to Russian attempts to gain access via other countries to spare parts, as well as the manufacturing of other jets that it obviously needs for its own use. And we reported on the podcast a few weeks ago about how at the UN they'd been desperate to try and get some of the limitations that they currently have around aircraft lifted, which were brought in as a consequence of the full-scale invasion, and they failed to do so. So I would wager that this deal struck with New Delhi would speak to their attempts to try and remedy the situation. But let's go then to another story. We're obviously reflecting at the moment about the peace talks that are potentially going to take place at some point between the US and Russia. Of course, the latest on this is that Budapest has been cancelled, as far as we can tell. And yet, Viktor Orban is expected to go to meet with Trump very soon, and it seems as if the Hungarian Foreign Ministry is also making overtures to Moscow. Joe, what's this story?
So it looks like Viktor Orban and the Hungarian government are essentially trying to act as the rescuers of these talks after Donald Trump and his people concluded that Russia wasn't serious and didn't actually want to come to the table with fresh ideas from what they heard in Alaska. So the Hungarian Foreign Minister, Peter Szijjarto, he has met with Lavrov. And this is what the Hungarian foreign minister has tweeted afterwards. So after last week's talks in the US, I met with FM Lavrov today. Pleased to hear that Russia is also ready to maintain high-level dialogue with the US. This gives hope for peace. We also discussed Hungary's energy security, which will be addressed with the US next week in Washington. So a few things to break down there. First, Hungary, desperate to have these talks happen because it plays well for Hungary and especially Viktor Orban, because he is fighting an election on the premise that Brussels, the EU, has failed to bring peace, and actually he's going to be the one to deliver it from a European perspective. But then I think the second important thing is, since Donald Trump has sanctioned Lukoil and Rosneft, you've seen this momentum about a renewed set of complaints about Hungary, Slovakia and Turkey, those three NATO allies, buying Russian fossil fuels. And Hungary is especially hit by this purely on the basis that it's landlocked. It relies on Russian fossil fuels and has basically saw opt-outs, blocked attempts by the EU to end the complete import of Russian fossil fuels into the EU. So it needs this war to end so it can continue buying in cheap fossil fuel from Russia. If that doesn't happen, and the Americans and EU come down hard on Russian exports, then Hungary is going to get caught in the middle of this, and they might suddenly find, because they have not looked at their alliance and not looked to water it on Russia, that they're suddenly going to get hit by a cost of living crisis, which isn't good news for Viktor Orban, because he's always played on this idea that he is the man delivering you a sort of a cheaper way of life than anyone else. And anything that he does with Russia is just his business to basically make family life better in Hungary. So interesting there that the Hungarians are desperately trying to salvage these talks after Donald Trump walked out. But we've got some more to say on the Trump piece. He's turning to China by the looks of it to help him deliver that ceasefire that he has long promised that he would be able to do, and it would be easy in 1 day, in 100 days, whatever. So he's apparently putting a lot of, and this is actually not just Donald Trump, it's also Ukraine. President Zelensky mentioned China's role a lot when he was in Brussels the other day. And so apparently President Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping meeting is going to be incredibly important for peace in Ukraine. And I think all sides are banking on that purely because China is seen as, while it hasn't given weapons to Russia, it hasn't, in Zelensky's words, it supported Ukraine, it hasn't offered help to Ukraine, and it doesn't want to see a Russian defeat. So what we're seeing is scores of smuggled Western components that come via China, manufacturing parts that helped, like machine tools, especially to build rockets and weapons and other stuff like that, are all coming from China to Moscow. So actually, if Trump can lean on Xi Jinping and maybe through his sort of tariff pressure can get Xi Jinping to have a word with Putin, or maybe Paul stop buying Russian oil and other Russian fossil fuels, he can put a lot of pressure on Putin that way. So maybe that's the new route he's going to take. And that meeting is set, I believe, for tomorrow. So we can have more on that as it happens.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. I'm really interested in the mood music in Brussels at the moment, following, of course, the failure to push forward on that frozen assets conundrum. So where are we in terms of this at the moment? Do you expect there to be changes, shifts, movement on this in the short term? Are we expecting progress in a week or 2 weeks? Or is this something that's going to drag on, Joe, do you think? I'm just interested really in the sense of momentum on this.
I'm just dragging up my diary to work out when the European Council meets in December. And according to that, it meets on the 18th and 19th. And that is going to be the key moment for what happens next in terms of European funding for Ukraine. So as you know, as our listeners know, Belgium the other day kiboshed any notion of a loan of worth 140 billion euros to Ukraine, which essentially will be guaranteed by mainly Berlin, the EU's largest economy, but would have a mechanism in it which basically stated if Russia doesn't pay reparations to Ukraine, Ukraine would not have to pay the loan back. It would be paid back through the frozen Russian assets inside Europe. 2/3 of the Russian central bank assets seized in the world are based in Belgium, in Brussels, a clearinghouse called Euroclear. So the Belgians had a few reservations about signing off on such a mechanism program. One, international reputation. Belgium makes a hell of a lot of money on the fact that it's seen as the clearinghouse sector of the euro transfers around the world. And suddenly, if all of these foreign governments or foreign people, foreign actors are suddenly going, actually, I don't want my assets being frozen and then seized and used to pay for something if the EU doesn't agree with something we're doing. So it risks that way. But then the other problem is, what happens if Moscow manages to launch an international legal case and wins? And then suddenly Belgium would have to pay back all of this money. It wants to spread that risk amongst all EU members. So it's not against the idea of this loan, it's just wants certain guarantees. So that was killed essentially at an EU summit. And then the next day, we had a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing. And my sources, my readouts from that meeting basically concluded that that was the main agenda point, was actually finding ways to use Russian assets to fund Ukraine. And in that meeting, Belgium kept quiet. It didn't oppose the idea of a loan. So the European Commission's representative on that, President Ursula von der Leyen, went away and said, look, I'm going to have you some proposals to have this ready by December. So apparently the European Commission have got proposals in the works, almost done. I think they're making some marginal tweaks basically to address Belgium's opposition. And I think minds are being focused in Belgium or in Brussels, EU land, by offering 3 separate ideas. First idea is this loan, this 140 billion with the guarantee if it's not paid back through Russian reparations, then the money will be seized. That's one idea. The next idea is a loan which is made up of common debt raised by the EU. So they would take out a joint debt on the international market under the EU's banner and they would pay it back themselves. It could be done. It's being talked about, but probably not everyone's first choice, because why should European taxpayers pay for Russia's war against Ukraine when Russia can pay for its own war against Ukraine? And then the third option, which no one's speaking about with any serious degree, but it has been put on the table, is that Europe brushes itself off of Ukraine, dusts its hands off and walks away, which I'm sure you'll find that idea is welcome in Hungary, in Slovakia, if we get this sudden anti-Ukraine axis inside the EU. But no one's really speaking about that seriously, but it's just been put on the table to focus minds. So I think we will get there by December. I think the Commission's going to come up with saying, I think Belgium are under enough pressure purely because the Americans currently like everything that Europe is doing for Ukraine in terms of financing American weapon sales to give to Ukraine, in terms of sanctions and stuff like that. So it would be sort of foolish to drive a wedge in between Europe and America by basically blocking this idea going forward. But yeah, that's where we stand.
Thanks, Joe. Just one final story, if I may. You've been looking at the impact of the relaxation of travel rules in Ukraine for 18 to 22-year-olds. What's the impact of this in terms of people leaving the country?
Yeah, so as our listeners will know, on August 28th, 2025, so this year, President Zelensky signed a decree which basically allowed 18 to 22-year-old men to leave Ukraine again. They had been blocked. I think it was anyone above 18 had been blocked from leaving under martial law, but that had been changed as basically Zelensky restructured sort of international travel rules alongside lowering conscription age, basically because I think he wanted to give something to youngsters who feared that they might one day get dragged into the army. But this has then seen a huge increase of people, of men between 18 and 22, leaving Ukraine and travelling to Europe. So there's been some interesting figures from the Polish border guard, and that's published in Politico. So Poland's border guards said 45,000 men between aged 18 and 22 entered Poland between January and August before the rules were introduced. And in the next 2 months after those restrictions were lifted, that number rose to 99,000 or 1,600 people per day, which is a huge number of people leaving across the border. So German media is reporting that a number of Ukrainian men aged between 18 and 22 entering Germany has jumped up 19%. Why is this important? I think that there's two reasons why. For a long, long time, mainly led by the Americans, but also some European governments have been leaning on Zelensky, encouraging him through their military advisors to lower the age of conscription and bring more young men into the Ukrainian armed forces to plug those manpower gaps that we've heard so much about on the front lines. Zelensky's always resisted that pressure, but he did lower the age slightly because of it. If European governments are suddenly seeing that there's lots of fighting age men leaving Ukraine, they might one day question their support for Ukraine if Ukraine is then losing ground and losing territory because of manpower shortages. The other thing to look at, and I think this is a particularly relevant story in Germany, but also in the UK, governments are under a lot of pressure because of migration, whether it be legitimate refugees, illegal migration, or just numbers coming into countries. And Western governments are having political issues of their own. So what this will act as, if we suddenly see a new influx of Ukrainian refugees coming into Europe, it will act as an acid test on whether Europe is actually serious about supporting Ukraine. Will it continue those refugee programs, or will it suddenly start shutting the door and winding down support for Ukrainians who are seeking shelter inside of Europe? And I think that's an interesting question that we're going to have to look at and address in the next few months when there's local elections or whatnot, by-elections everywhere, being fought on this migration issue.
Well, thanks very much, Joe. Please don't go whining and dining too many of the officials in Brussels. We need them to keep pushing forward on solving that frozen assets conundrum. But let's turn to another subject now, bringing in Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator at The Telegraph, David Blair. David, welcome back. In a previous episode, you talked about a trip around the Baltics you'd done, looking into how those nations are laying minefields in the most vulnerable sections of NATO's eastern flank. And as we've talked about on the podcast before, one of the major problems for Europe is, were the worst to happen, how they would logistically be able to move troops to where they need to go. And you've been looking into a new motorway that's been built to address just this issue. Where is it, David, and why is it so important?
Well, you'll remember, Francis, that Napoleon is supposed to have said an army marches on its stomach, and it also marches on roads. And along those roads comes what you need to feed an army. So roads really matter. And a strategic problem that NATO has always faced is that the three most exposed allies, the three Baltic states, are geographically connected to the rest of NATO only by a very narrow corridor through which only one main road runs. And that's the E67 motorway, which goes northeast from Warsaw for 600 miles up through Lithuania, then Latvia, and finally to Tallinn in Estonia. And until quite recently, the whole of that road was just 2 lanes. Now, the vital section connecting Poland with Lithuania has been upgraded to be a proper motorway with 4 lanes. And this was felt to be such an important occasion that the presidents of both Poland and Lithuania met on the border to inaugurate the opening of this new motorway, which just shows that it is not exactly a normal infrastructure project.
Well, I'm glad to hear that we've got a Napoleon reference in, and not from me for once. So, David, in terms of the logistical side of this, the nature of the bridge is one thing in its location, but as we've talked about before on the podcast, there is a real problem across Europe with the strength of these bridges in terms of being able to carry tanks and heavy weapons and, of course, the troops concerned. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit about that in relation to this bridge or this route.
It's more a route than a bridge. And it's true that the old road wasn't actually strong enough to take the heaviest machines of war, tank transporters, self-propelled artillery and so forth. But it has now been upgraded. So the vital section of the road goes through this stretch about 50 miles wide of Lithuania and Poland, which is in between Kaliningrad, Russia's exclave, and Belarus, which is now effectively, of course, a Russian client state. So Putin's tanks are ever going to come. They're going to try and capture that 50-mile stretch, which is called the Suwalki Gap, because if they can get that, they can block the only reinforcement route that runs overland between the Baltic states and the rest of NATO. So that means it's even more important to make sure that reinforcements can pass quickly up this road so that in the event of an emergency, NATO can rush forces to reinforce the Baltic states as fast as possible. So the way to think of this, Francis, is on the one hand, you've got the construction of a whole series of fortifications and physical defences, which all three Baltic states plus Poland are all in the business of putting together right now, plus the minefields, which I reported on a few months ago, which could come into being if needed, now that all four countries are withdrawing from the Ottawa Convention to allow them to resume the production of and storage of landmines. And that's all designed to slow down any Russian attack. And then upgrading the road is designed to speed up the arrival of NATO reinforcements. So the combination of those two things is what should make that part of NATO much safer and more secure. Now, I should say that the situation has changed dramatically for the better since 2023, when Sweden and Finland joined NATO. Because now that they're both allies, that means that the Baltic is effectively a NATO lake. And that what that means is that we are no longer simply reliant on an overland reinforcement route to get extra troops into the Baltic states in an emergency. Conceivably, they could use Baltic sea routes as well. So that makes the overall strategic position of NATO in that part of Europe more secure.
Fascinating. I note in your piece, which of course we'll link to, David, in the show notes, that Poland spent 2.6 billion euros on upgrading its section of the road, and then almost 1 billion came from the European Union. I just wondered whether in your reporting you found that there'd been any obstacles for the EU to fund this road. Because, of course, we know the characters that Joe was talking about earlier in Slovakia, in Hungary, that might object to certain activities that cost money and relate to defence in NATO.
I'm not aware of any obstruction. And, of course, for the EU to fund roads in its European member states is not exactly unusual. And I suspect that if you're thinking of Hungary or Slovakia, I strongly suspect there's quite a few roads in both of those countries that were funded by the EU. So it would be quite an odd thing for them to object to.
Interesting. And just before we end on this story, David, I'm interested in what the reaction from the Lithuanians was to this, because I know that you spoke to one of the retired majors from their army.
It makes a big difference, because I was surprised to learn this, Francis. You maybe already knew this, but if you move a single infantry battalion, that can require about 4 miles of traffic. And if you're going to move a division, that requires thousands of vehicles. So if you have only a 2-lane highway on which to do that, it only takes one accident or one breakdown, and the whole column comes to a shuddering halt. So the more road space, the wider the road that you have, the bigger the difference it makes. And you might remember, Francis, Operation Market Garden in 1944 failed because 30 Corps were unable to get to the bridge too far in Arnhem, because they only had one not very wide road to advance up, and the Germans were able to halt them. So nothing changes really in warfare. Roads are still absolutely vital. And the wider and better and stronger the road, the better it is for you.
Absolutely. I remember asking General Ben Hodges, who will be familiar to many listeners, we interviewed him on the podcast only a few weeks ago. And when I asked him, what's your biggest fear? He said that the lack of logistical understanding about what it takes to move armies. And that was something also that was relayed when we were in Washington back in 2023 at the ISW. They were very keen to emphasise that this was a very serious problem. So, of course, it's very welcome to see that Europe is reacting. And you mentioned Operation Market Garden there. I was actually at the 71st anniversary of that battle and was able to shake hands with some of the very last veterans there. So I know very well about the situation. I visited the famous bridge that was captured just in Arnhem after the British troops travelled from Oosterbeek, where they'd landed from. Of course, another battle of the Second World War that was highly shaped by issues around roads and roads being blocked was the Battle of the Bulge. And there are arguments they would have made a lot more progress, the Germans, in their advances, were it not for certain operations that destroyed bridges that led to tank groups having to completely about turn and it taking them a whole other day to go back from where they'd come from. And obviously when every hour counts, that makes a massive difference. So no, absolutely, David, you're right that this is a really, really critical issue, often underexplored. So thank you very much for raising it with us today. And as I say, we'll link to that piece in the show notes. I leave the episode though with you, David. Where would you like to leave listeners? What has caught your eye this week, or what are you preparing to be analysing in the coming days?
I think the big question now is whether Trump's new sanctions on Russia, specifically on Rosneft and Lukoil, are going to have a significant effect on Russian revenues, and whether in his meeting with Xi Jinping tomorrow, he's going to be able to persuade China to reduce its purchases of Russian oil. If he can, this is going to make a big difference.
Thanks very much, David. We leave you today with a clip from an extended interview from the Telegraph's new weekly video podcast, Battle Lines Global Health Security, which, as the name suggests, releases on the same feed as our sister podcast, Battle Lines. It examines critical subjects like bioweapons, war zone diseases, and frontline medicine. The latest episode asks, has the threat of biological weapons returned? And Arthur Scott Geddes speaks to Dr. Ken Alibek, former deputy chief of the Soviet Union's biological weapons program, who defected to the US in 1992. Ken reflects on Soviet bioweapon tactics and explores the threat Russia poses today.
Hello, Ken. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to Battle Lines.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
You've written a lot about how surprised you were when you got to the United States, and you sort of found some complacency around the idea of biological weapons. You know, people were perhaps a bit naive about other actors carrying on developing them. Do you think that we in the West take the threat that they pose seriously enough?
People I talk to were kind of politicians, scientists in the field of biodefense or defense in general. Many of these people, they use their understanding of honesty, let me say, and compliance. You know, for example, if somebody says, okay, we're not doing this, it means they really don't do this. Many of them couldn't even understand that, for example, it doesn't matter what, for example, some Russian official would tell. Like a recent example, Putin was always saying, okay, we will never attack Ukraine. Yes, we're not crazy. We're not going to do anything like this. It's, you know, because it's, you know, and people believed it. But in reality, it was absolutely different. Or something like what's happening today, okay, just because when Putin says, okay, all European countries they're stupid because we don't have plans to attack European countries, it means absolutely opposite. It means he and his military have plans to attack the West. Because it's a general principle, okay, just lie. You know, we cannot apply Western logic.
One of the most striking things from your book, which you published in 1999, was a warning that biological weapons would soon become part of all our lives. What could you see happening that made you make that warning? And do you feel like the risk posed by these weapons is increasing?
I cannot say whether it's a threat or not, but I know for sure, let me put it this way, without elaborating, that the research in the field continues. Okay, whether it's coming to the point of developing weapons, or it's still, let me say, kind of research, analyzing possible applications, genetic modifications, developing novel principles of fermentation, and I cannot tell this for sure.
In Europe at the moment, we're seeing a far-reaching Russian campaign to disrupt lots of areas, lots of sort of economic areas. We've seen things like internet cables being cut. We've seen warehouses being set on fire as part of this kind of hybrid warfare campaign that's going on in the shadows. How would a biological weapon fit into that campaign? And did you ever work on any projects that might have filled that niche in your time in the program?
It's impossible to compare the Putin's regime and the Soviet Union's, regime, because the Soviet Union really wanted to have a peace. They didn't want to create, trouble. Nobody wanted to fight because many people still remembered about the previous World War II. But the current government, is completely different. In this case, what is going to come to their mind? All these so-called ideas of hybrid wars. Just using different things to disrupt normal lives. In this case, there are several things. I don't think they're going to use, obviously, some biological agent, deploying as a weapon. Just like using military devices. But to roll out something, to create small epidemics and causing scare, I cannot rule it out. Because you remember that there was a period when they started accusing Ukraine and the United States in bioweapons, It was so horrible because they knew perfectly well there was no anything like this. Because they were translating, their own ideas how to deploy them, to accuse some other countries.
You can join Venetia Rainey and Arthur Scott Gettis on Battle Line's Global Health Security every Wednesday via podcast apps or YouTube. We'll add a link in the show notes. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.